My wife called me a safety net on her podcast, so I cut the net. While fixing my wife's laptop, I find raw footage of her Girl Talk podcast where she mocks my blue-collar job and admits she's only with me until her soulmate finishes his residency. I don't confront her. I quietly move my assets and let her soulmate discover she's broke before she can jump ship. I always thought the hum of a table saw was the sound of an honest life, but it turns out, to the woman I loved, it was just the background noise of a waiting room. The dust in my workshop usually feels like progress. It's cedar, oak, and pine, the materials of a life built with my own two hands. I'm a carpenter. I take pride in the way a joint fits together so perfectly you can't see the seam. I thought my marriage was built the same way. I thought Sarah and I were interlocking pieces held together by the kind of glue that only decades of shared coffee and quiet Tuesday nights can provide. But I was wrong. I wasn't her partner. I was her structural support. And you don't fall in love with a support beam. You just hope it holds until you find a better place to live. Sarah and I had been married for 8 years. We met when I was installing custom cabinetry in the boutique marketing firm where she worked. She was all sharp blazers and quick wit. I was flannel shirts and a tape measure. People joked that we were an unlikely match, but I loved the contrast. She gave me ambition, and I gave her a place to land. By our 6th year, Sarah decided to chase a dream. She wanted to be a digital creator. She started a podcast called The Modern Muse, focusing on lifestyle, career growth, and relationships. I was proud of her. I built her a soundproof studio in our spare bedroom, hand-carving the mahogany desk she sat at every night. "You're my rock, Elias," she'd say, kissing my cheek as I handed her a cup of tea before she went live. "I couldn't do any of this without you." And I believed her. Our life felt grounded. We had a small, comfortable home in the suburbs of Portland. My business, Grain and Grace, was steady. I came home with sawdust in my hair and grease under my fingernails, and she'd meet me at the door with a glass of wine and stories about her guests. I felt like the luckiest man alive because I had a woman who saw the value in the work I did, even if she lived in a world of pixels and sponsorship deals. I didn't mind being the primary breadwinner while her channel grew. I paid the mortgage, the equipment costs, and the designer clothes she said she needed for branding. To me, it wasn't my money or her money, it was ours. The shift was subtle at first. It started with the way she looked at my hands. Usually she'd hold them over dinner, but lately her eyes would linger on my calluses with a flicker of something that looked like pity or maybe boredom. She started talking more about alignment and elevating one's circle. "Elias," Sarah said one night, swirling her Pinot Noir, "do you ever think about expanding? Maybe getting out of the shop and managing a firm? You're so talented, but you're always so dirty when you get home." "I like the dirt, Sarah," I laughed, though it felt a bit hollow. "The dirt means I actually made something today." She just hummed and looked at her phone. Then there was Julian. Julian was a friend from college who had recently resurfaced. He was finishing his residency at a prestigious hospital in Seattle. Sarah spoke about him often, how hard he worked, how refined his life was, and how they used to stay up all night talking about philosophy. "He's coming through town next month," she mentioned casually while she was editing a video. "We should have him over for dinner. He's going to be a surgeon, you know, high-stakes stuff." "Sure, I'd love to meet the man who makes my carpentry look like a hobby." She didn't laugh. She just turned back to her monitor. The distance between us began to grow, not in miles, but in decibels. She spent more time in that soundproof studio I built for her than she did in our bed. When she did come out, she was distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. She started password protecting her tablet and taking business calls in the garden where I couldn't hear. I told myself it was just the stress of her growing brand. I told myself I was being insecure. I'm a builder. When I see a crack in the foundation, my instinct is to patch it, not to assume the whole house is falling down. But then her laptop fan started making a grinding noise. "Elias, "Can you look at this?" she asked one morning, rushing out the door for a brunch meeting. "It's overheating. I have a huge episode to upload by tonight. Please, just see if you can fix it." I took it to my workbench. I'm better with wood than circuits, but I know how to clear a cooling fan. I opened the casing, cleaned the dust, and booted it up to check the internal temperature. That's when I saw the folder on her desktop. It wasn't labeled podcast. It was labeled raw footage, unedited, do not use. My cursor hovered over it. A knot tied itself in my stomach. I shouldn't have clicked. A husband should trust his wife, but the silence in the house felt heavy, and the look she'd given my calloused hands the night before was still stinging. I clicked. The video file was a recording of a Girl Talk episode she'd filmed a day before with her co-host Mia. It hadn't been edited. There were no filters, no transition music, just Sarah sitting at the mahogany desk I built for her, talking into the microphone I paid for. "So," Mia's voice came through the speakers, "when are you going to tell Elias about the Seattle plan?" Sarah laughed. It wasn't the warm laugh I heard at dinner. It was sharp, performative. "I'm not," Sarah said, leaning back. "Not until Julian gets his official placement at the surgical center. We've already talked about it. Julian is my soulmate, Mia. He's the life I was always supposed to have." "But Elias is so sweet," Mia said, though she sounded like she was mocking him. "Elias is a safety net," Sarah snapped, her eyes cold on the screen. "He's steady, he's blue collar, and he pays the bills while I build my empire. He's like a comfortable pair of old work boots. You wear them while you're hiking through the mud, but you don't wear them to the gala. Once Julian is settled and I have my following, the net gets cut. I'm just biding my time." I sat there, the smell of cedar still clinging to my shirt, and watched my world turn to ash.
The video didn't stop there. I wish it had. I wish I could have closed the laptop and preserved some shred of the woman I thought I knew. But I sat frozen, the blue light of the screen bleeding into the shadows of my workshop. "But Sarah," Mia's voice continued, a bit of a smirk in her tone, "what about the house? The business? You guys have been together for nearly a decade. Isn't it going to be messy?" Sarah waved a hand dismissively, the sunlight catching the wedding band I'd saved for 2 years to buy. "Elias is simple. He lives for his wood and his saws. He's put everything into the joint account because he trusts me with the logistics. The house is in both our names, but I've been slowly moving my sponsorship earnings into a private offshore account Julian helped me set up. By the time I leave, I'll have my half of the equity, my full career, and a surgeon waiting for me in a penthouse. Elias, he'll be fine. He'll just find some other girl who likes the smell of sawdust and doesn't mind a man who spends his life making chairs." She laughed then, a light, airy sound that usually made my heart skip. Now it sounded like the screech of a blade hitting a hidden nail. "Besides," Sarah added, leaning into the mic with a conspiratorial whisper, "I can't wait to stop pretending I care about craftsmanship. I want a life that's polished, Mia, not one that needs sanding down every weekend." The video ended. The screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me. I looked older, grayer. I looked like a man who had spent 8 years building a cathedral only to find out it was a movie set made of cardboard. I didn't throw the laptop. I didn't scream. In my trade, when you realize a measurement is off by an inch, you don't burn the wood. You stop, you breathe, and you figure out how to salvage the project. I carefully closed the laptop, wiped a stray fingerprint off the casing with a microfiber cloth, and set it back on the charging port. My hands were shaking, but my mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I walked out of the house and sat in my truck. I needed to move. I drove to the site of my current project, a library for a local elementary school. I spent 4 hours sanding white oak. The repetitive motion, the grit, the physical exertion, it was the only thing keeping me from unraveling. A safety net. That's what she called me. She wanted a polished life. She wanted the Seattle plan. Fine, but a safety net only works if it's anchored to something solid, and I was about to pull the anchors. The next morning, I didn't confront her. When she came down for breakfast, acting the part of the busy, affectionate wife, I played my part too. "Laptop's fixed," I said, my voice steady, though it felt like I was swallowing glass. "Just some dust in the fan. You should be good for your upload tonight." "Oh, Elias, you're a lifesaver," she chirped, kissing my cheek. She smelled like expensive perfume, the kind I'd bought her for our anniversary. Handyman, not husband, not partner. "I'm going to be putting in some overtime this week," I told her, staring into my coffee. "Big contract for a commercial office. I'll be coming home late, probably staying at the shop some nights to meet the deadline." "That's fine, babe," she said, already scrolling through her phone. "I've got lots of planning to do with Julian and the girls anyway." I watched her walk away, and the grief I felt started to harden into something else. It wasn't exactly revenge, it was justice. If I was just a net to her, then she shouldn't mind when I stopped catching her fall. I spent the next 3 days with my lawyer, a man named Marcus who had been a client of mine for years. He looked at the evidence I had gathered, the recording I had copied to a thumb drive, the bank statements showing the lopsided joint contributions, and the trail of her private account. "She's been clever, Elias," he said, tapping a pen against his desk, "but she made one mistake. She assumes you're as simple as she told her audience. She hasn't realized that the business, the tools, and the commercial contracts are all tied to your name as a sole proprietorship, and that joint account, since she's been siphoning her earnings out, the money in there is almost entirely yours from your last 3 big commissions. I want to protect the business, and I want her to realize that the polished life she's chasing is built on my labor." "We can do more than that," Marcus replied with a grim smile. "We can file for legal separation immediately. Since you're the one who provided the safety net, we can freeze the joint assets for an audit. If she wants to jump to her surgeon, she's going to have to do it with her own pockets, not yours." But I knew Sarah. Money was only half of her world. The other half was her reputation, her brand. She wanted to be the hero of her own story. She wanted to leave the boring carpenter for the brilliant surgeon and have her followers cheer for her growth. I wasn't going to let her write that script. I knew Julian was coming to town in 2 days. They were planning a celebratory dinner at a high-end restaurant downtown to toast his new position. She thought I was working late at the shop. Instead, I spent those 2 days quietly moving my life out. I didn't take much, just my clothes, my personal mementos, and my tools. I left the mahogany desk. I left the furniture I'd built for her. They were reminders of a love that never actually existed. The night of their dinner, I received a notification on my phone. Sarah had just uploaded a new podcast episode titled, "When You Outgrow Your Environment, Choosing Yourself Over Comfort." I didn't need to listen to it to know I was the environment she had outgrown. I took a deep breath, put on my best suit, the one I'd bought for her sister's wedding, and drove to the restaurant. It was time to meet the soulmate.
The restaurant was one of those places where the lighting is dim enough to hide secrets, but the silverware is polished enough to reflect them. I saw them through the window before I even stepped inside. Sarah looked radiant. She was wearing a silk dress the color of a bruised plum, her hair perfectly coiffed, her laughter ringing out even through the glass. And there was Julian. He looked exactly like the man she'd described, sharp, sterile, and expensive. He wore a watch that probably cost more than my first truck, and he listened to her with the indulgent smile of a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. I took a breath, smoothed my jacket, and walked in. The hostess tried to stop me, but I gave her a polite nod and walked straight to their table. Sarah's laugh died mid-air. Her glass of wine hovered near her lips, then slowly descended to the white linen cloth. "Elias," she whispered, her eyes darting to Julian, then back to me. "What are you doing here? I thought you were at the shop." "The job finished early," I said, my voice remarkably calm. I pulled out the empty chair at the head of the table and sat down, and I realized I'd never properly met the man who's going to be taking over my structural duties. Julian's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "This is my husband," Sarah said quickly, her face flushing a deep, panicked red. "Elias, please, this is a professional dinner. We're discussing a collaboration." "A collaboration," I repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what you call it on the podcast? Or do you prefer the term soulmate when the cameras are off?" Julian's polite smile vanished. He looked at Sarah, then at me. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Julian, I said, leaning forward. I've seen the unedited footage, the Seattle plan, the safety net. It's a very thorough strategy. I have to hand it to you, Sarah. You're a much better architect than I gave you credit for. You built an entire life on top of me while I was busy keeping the roof over your head. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the tears of a woman who was sorry. They were the tears of a woman whose stage lights had just burned out. "Elias, you're making a scene," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "We can talk about this at home." "There is no home, Sarah. I moved out this morning. The locks are being changed as we speak. And since you've been so diligent about moving your empire into that private account, I'm sure you won't mind that I've frozen the joint funds for the divorce proceedings. After all, a safety net is only useful if it's there to catch you. I decided to fold mine up." The color drained from her face. Julian, who had been watching this like a spectator at a car crash, cleared his throat. "Wait, Julian," his voice clipped and clinical. "What do you mean, frozen? Sarah, you told me the equity from the house and the business was already liquidated into your venture fund. You said you were the primary stakeholder." I laughed, and for the first time in weeks, it felt genuine. "She's a digital creator, Julian. She creates illusions. The house is half mine, and the business is all mine. And the debt, the $20,000 in credit card bills for her branding equipment and designer wardrobe, that's all in her name. I made sure of that today." Julian looked at Sarah. The indulgent smile was gone. In its place was the cold, calculating gaze of a man who didn't deal in safety nets. He dealt in assets. "Sarah," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, "you told me you were coming to Seattle with a full portfolio and the capital to start the new agency. If you're tied up in a messy divorce and debt—" "Julian, he's lying." Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice rising. "He's just trying to ruin this for me because he's a small-minded carpenter who can't handle my success." "I'm not ruining anything, Sarah," I said, standing up. "I'm just letting you be the modern muse you claim to be. You wanted to choose yourself over comfort? Well, here's your chance. No more sawdust, no more boring stability. Just you, your brand, and your soulmate." I looked at Julian. "Good luck with the residency, doctor. I hope she's worth the overhead." I walked out of that restaurant without looking back. My heart was pounding, but my hands were still. For years, I had been the one holding everything together: the house, the finances, the emotional weight of her dreams. It was a heavy burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying until I set it down on that dinner table. I drove back to my shop. I had a cot in the back office and a fridge full of cold water. It wasn't a penthouse in Seattle, but as I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the smell of cedar and the tools of my trade, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt solid. The fallout was swifter than I expected. Sarah, true to form, tried to get ahead of the story. The next day, she posted a frantic video on her Instagram story about toxic masculinity and how her unsupportive husband is trying to financially abuse her by locking her out of their home. But Sarah forgot one thing. She wasn't the only one who knew how to use the internet. The thumb drive that Marcus had given me didn't just contain the evidence for the divorce. It contained the raw footage of her mocking her audience, the very women who bought her merchandise and listened to her advice. She had called them gullible sheep in a part of the video I hadn't even finished watching that first night. I didn't leak it. I didn't have to. Mia, her co-host, had been feeling sidelined for months. When she saw the ship sinking, she decided to grab the only lifeboat available. She released the behind-the-scenes outtakes on her own channel, framing herself as the whistleblower who couldn't stand Sarah's duplicity any longer. The Modern Muse brand didn't just crack, it shattered. Sponsors pulled out within 48 hours. Her follower count dropped by the tens of thousands. The comment sections, once filled with heart emojis and "Yes, Queen," were now a battlefield of betrayal. "You used your husband's hard work to fund your lies?" one comment read. "A safety net? No, honey. He was the floor, and you just jumped into a basement," wrote another. But the biggest blow came from Seattle. Marcus called me 3 days later.
"Elias, you might want to check the news or just your email." I opened a message from an anonymous account. It was a photo of Julian at a different restaurant, sitting across from a woman that definitely wasn't Sarah. The caption simply said, "Surgeons don't marry debt, they marry prestige." Julian hadn't just distanced himself from the scandal, he'd ghosted her entirely. The Seattle plan was dead.
The silence that followed the storm was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. For weeks, my phone buzzed with desperate texts from Sarah. They went from furious and accusatory to pleading and broken. She was staying at a budget motel. Her credit cards declined. Her empire reduced to a collection of ring lights and expensive handbags she couldn't sell fast enough. "Elias, please," one message read. "I was just caught up in the pressure. I didn't mean those things. We can fix this. I'm coming home." But I didn't answer. I didn't change the locks back. I had spent 8 years fixing things for her. Broken shelves, broken spirits, broken promises. This was the one thing I couldn't sand down and refinish. I spent my days in the shop. There's a specific peace that comes with working wood when you have nothing left to lose. You stop rushing. You listen to the grain. I started a new project, not for a client, but for myself. A solid walnut dining table, heavy, permanent, something that couldn't be moved by a whim or a plan. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom battle Sarah had threatened. Without the Seattle plan and without Julian's backing, she didn't have the stamina for a fight. She took her half of the house equity, which after paying off her secret debts and legal fees was barely enough to cover a year's rent on a modest apartment, and she disappeared from the digital world. The last I heard, she was working in a mid-level marketing firm in a different city. Her modern muse persona, a ghost of the internet. I kept the shop, I kept my name, and slowly I started to keep my peace. I remember sitting at that walnut table for the first time, alone in my new, smaller house. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the floor. I looked at my hands. They were still calloused, they were still scarred, but they were mine. I realized then that she was right about one thing. I was a safety net. But I wasn't just hers, I was my own. I had the skills to build a life from scratch, to take raw, unformed pieces of reality and turn them into something beautiful and functional. I didn't need a polished life, I needed an authentic one. One evening, a few months after the papers were signed, I was finishing a set of chairs for a local cafe. A woman I'd seen around town, a gardener named Clara, who always had dirt under her nails and a quick, genuine smile, stopped by the shop to pick up a planter box I'd made for her. "You put a lot of heart into this, Elias," she said, running her hand over the cedar. "I can feel the strength in it. It's built to last." "That's the goal," I said, smiling for what felt like the first time in a year. "Anything worth having should be." She looked at me, then at the shop, then back at me. "The smell of sawdust. It's the best smell in the world, isn't it? It smells like honesty." I watched her walk away, and for the first time, the weight in my chest didn't feel like grief. It felt like space. Space for something new to grow. I sat back on my workbench, the ticking clock in the corner the only sound in the room. I thought about the man I was when I watched that video, the man who felt like his foundation had crumbled. He was gone. In his place was a man who knew that a safety net is only a weakness if you let someone else hold the scissors. Life isn't a podcast. There are no edits, no music transitions to soften the blow when the truth comes out. Sometimes the people we love don't see us for who we are. They see us for what we can provide. They see a tool, a ladder, or a net. But you are more than the support you provide to others. You are the architect of your own dignity. I lost a marriage, but I found my worth. I lost a polished future, but I gained a grounded present. And in the end, I'd rather have sawdust on my hands than a lie in my heart. If you found yourself standing where I stood, watching the person you love admit you were just a means to an end, would you have the strength to let them fall? Or would you keep holding the net, hoping they'd change their mind? Tell me in the comments. Your stories remind me that none of us are building alone. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We're here to tell the stories that usually stay hidden in the shadows of our homes. Until next time, take care of your heart
and keep building.